I want to be clear what I'm talking about with distribution. First of all, regardless of what we're measuring, we usually refer to them as scores. I can have a score on an age scale, which would be my age. I can have a score on a test scale. I can have a score on a personality survey. Whenever I use the word score, I'm referring to those data points. Remember that we are looking at the frequency right now when we're talking about distribution. The distribution is talking about how the points or scores are spread out over that range. Look at the graph for A. The points are spread out over a wide range, and in the middle there were more counts of each score, although not too many more, especially when you compare that to graph B. That range is very small, and look how large the count is for the scores in the middle. There were a lot of frequency. The frequency is really high of each of those scores in the middle. This is why we refer to the distribution shape. When we talk about the distribution, there are always three pieces. First, we can talk about the shape. Second, we can talk about the average or the mean, which is what we're talking about when we're talking central tendency. And finally, we can talk about the variation in the scores. Or are they clumped together, or are they spread far apart? Anytime we're discussing a score, it has no meaning just as an isolated score. It's meaningless until we know what the scale is and where that score falls in the range. Think of the number 27. It doesn't mean anything unless you know what the range is. Until you know where it falls in the distribution, you really can't even use the information. If 27 is a score on an exam that ranges from 0 to 30, that meaning or that inherent value of 27 is much different than it is if it's from an exam with a range of 0 to 700. So when we're talking percentiles, this is one way of helping you know where the score falls in that distribution, whether it falls near the top with lots of other scores beneath it, or whether it falls near the bottom with just a few scores beneath it and most of the scores above it. So this is what we call a percentile. The 60th percentile means that that score, that 27, we'll go back to that example, is at the 60th percentile, then 60% of the scores on that test or that scale or whatever you're using are at or below it. If that score is actually at the 80th percentile, then it's way higher, and 80% of the scores are below it. If I now tell you that 27 is a score at the 25th percentile, then that means it's way down near the bottom, and only 25% of the scores are at 27 or lower. Remember, we're talking about the frequency of each score. But if I tell you that 27 is at the 80th percentile, 80% of the scores are below it. So 27 is much higher in the ranking. Let's look now at how percentile is calculated. I'm going to use an example of just 7 numbers, and I want you to understand this conceptually first. Then we'll look at some equations. I gave a quiz to 7th graders. There were 15 points possible, and these are the scores. Bill got 5, Sue got 1, George scored 9, Mary 3, Sam 14, Pete 9, and Kathy 7. First, I'm going to make a frequency chart so that I know how often each score was earned. You can see that there was only one person earned a score of 1, one earned a score of 3, one of 5, one of 7. There were 2 people, George and Pete, who scored a 9, and then there was one person who scored a 14. Next, I'm going to figure out the cumulative frequency of the scores from the lowest to the highest. Because remember, with a percentile, I'm trying to find a point where it accounts for all the scores below it. So the score of 1, there was only one score at that point. The score of 3, it occurred once, so to find its cumulative frequency, I add that to the score of 1, so I get a 2. And I keep adding them up like that until I reach a cumulative frequency of all 7 scores that I've had. Notice that I had a cumulative frequency at the score of 7. That 7 and below accounted for 4 scores. 9 and below accounted for 6 scores because there were 2 people who scored 9. Notice something else about that score of 7. There are 3 scores above it and 3 scores below it. So I want to find the 50th percentile. In other words, I want to find out where 50% of the scores are below that number or below. That number's my index. So I get it by taking the number of scores I've got, I have a 7, and multiplying it by the percent, which in this case is 50% because I want the 50th percentile. So I end up with 3.5. That tells me that there were 3.5 intervals or chunks to get below the 50th percentile. 3.5 is not a whole number, so I'm going to round it up to 4. Now I simply count the intervals. Remember, I'm looking for where I can find 4 intervals and account for 50% of my scores. There's 1 interval, 2, 3, and there's the 4th one. And lo and behold, the score of 7 is at the 50th percentile. 50% of the scores are below it, and 50% happen to be above it. Now let's do the same thing using that very complicated formula, 3.1 on page 48 of your textbook. To do this, we need to know the cumulative percentage of the scores at each interval. Let me back up here a minute though. I do expect you to be able to calculate things like percentiles using the formulas that are given in your textbook. You need to understand conceptually that you're counting the intervals to find the percentile of scores below that number and the percentile above. And it's much easier to use a formula, especially if you've got a few more numbers than 7. So at interval 1, which is a score of 1, it occurs once and the cumulative frequency is 1. At that point, I've accounted for 14.29% of all the scores in this list. When I get to score 3, it occurred once. I'm now accounting for 2 of the scores out of the 7. By the time I get to 3, I've got another 14.29% of the frequencies, and the cumulative is 28.58. It doesn't matter which way you come up with that cumulative percent. You can add them either way. But what you're saying is that at score 3, that 3 and below accounts for 28.58% of all the scores I've got in this list. And I keep doing that until I get to 100% of the frequencies of the scores are represented. That means that at the score of 14 and below, all 100% of the scores are represented. Look at the score of 5. 5 and below accounts for 42.87% of all the scores on this test. So I'm trying to find the 50th percentile. I look for the interval in which 50% of the cumulative frequencies fall. Well, by the time I get to a score of 7 and below, I've accounted for 57.16% of all of the scores. So that interval is the one I'm interested in here to find the score for the 50th percentile. Next, we need the lower limit of the score in that interval. You will recall that the lower limit for a score of 7 is really 6.5 and the upper limit is 7.4. So I replace LL with 6.5. Now we need the number of scores we have. There were 7 scores. So that goes right in there. And I need to multiply that by the proportion that I'm looking for. Remember, I'm looking for the 50th percentile. So I'm looking for a proportion of 0.50 or 50%. Let's keep going across the formula. The cumulative frequency of the scores I'm looking for is in the interval that's below the one of interest, the next lower one, because I'm accounting for those scores. So in this case, I'm looking for the cumulative frequency for a score of 5 and below. You may want to highlight that in your textbook or notes because that's where a lot of us go wrong when we start using this formula. We're always looking for what's accounted for below the percentile we're interested in. Next, we need the frequency of the scores in the interval for that 50th percentile. So we go back to our place where 50% are accounted for, and the frequency of the score for 7 is 1. Finally, we need the width of the interval. In my simple example here, we're not using groups of scores, so the width is simply 1. Now we simply solve, remembering to account for the proper order of the different operations. So I go to my brackets first, multiply those, and then I add them to the 6.5. And lo and behold, at the 50th percentile is the score of 7. And that means, remember, 7 and below account for 50% of all the scores in the rankings. This is not nearly as complicated as it seems. I would suggest that you go through the example in your textbook using different colors or highlighters or pencils and practice and make sure you can see where the author got every one of those numbers that are used in the example.